Go for it.
Yeah. Okay, so welcome everybody. My name's Peter Wishart. I'm the Vice Chair of the IEEE Aeronautics and Electronic Systems Society, one of the sponsors along with UNSW of Space Engineering of this talk. It is my pleasure to introduce John Saxon. Often when we hear about these talks about space, we're looking to the future and looking at all the wonderful things that are going to happen. John's going to take us on a journey. He's going to take us on a journey back and remind us that Canberra has been involved in the space industry for many, many decades. And John's been involved in that. And we're very privileged to have John here to talk about his experience with NASA and the Apollo program. John.
Thank you, Peter. I just want to make sure that people can hear me. Can people hear me around the place?
Yeah.
Good. Yes, the first person to join this conference was my ex-boss, I notice. So I've got to watch my language. Yeah, how lucky can you be? You know, they were interviewing in London for all 3 tracking stations that started here in the ACT. And I was offered jobs at Honeysuckle and Timbabilla, and I wasn't offered one at Rural Valley. I don't think they like the look of me, but yeah, it was great. I was able to, sponsored by Timbabilla, I was able to emigrate to Australia and then say, sorry, Timbabilla, I want to go to Honeysuckle. So they moved me there. And I was really keen to get into the manned spaceflight stuff back then. That's where it was all happening. Had unlimited funds. That was one of the first things. And that makes a big difference. So I'm going to start the presentation now. And the idea of this presentation is to ask why Armstrong's first steps on the moon and a whole lot of other things happened down under. First of all, we were the only station in the Southern Hemisphere. So anything that came south of the equator, we got, although there was a station at Carnarvon in Western Australia, but unfortunately they had a smaller antenna than us, so they weren't a lunar distance station. And this might illustrate what I mean by a lunar distance station, in that we had 85-foot, 26-meter diameter antennas for lunar distance work. And there's only 3 around the world because obviously the moon is further away than 16,000 kilometers. So if you've got 3 stations around the world like that, you can basically see what's going on. Oh yes, they did get as far as Madrid. Actually, we had a much longer overlap with Goldstone in California than we had with Madrid. So when it came time to hand over the spacecraft to the next station, we were handing over to Madrid, and there wasn't much time to do that. Okay, I'm going to move right along. What I'd like to do is to keep this. I've got quite a lot of slides here, so I'll send them, show them all, and hopefully we'll have 10 minutes left at the end for questions. If we don't, I'm on email and all the rest of it. I've even got some cards I can hang them up. Oh no, I'm not sure where they are. Oh, I know where they are. Okay. So back in 1966, there was 3 tracking stations in the ACT. Timbabilla right here, Honeysuckle down there, Rural Valley down there. We had a microwave link between ourselves and Timbabilla with a passive repeater. Oh golly, that made it get bigger. A passive repeater on top of a hill just near the station called Dead Man's Hill, but it worked. Okay, and this was honeysuckle in the very early days. Later on, we put a Spanish flag up as well. The antenna was on a little hill above the main building here, which was an operations building and administration and everything else. And this was a microwave link going over to Tipperville that we've talked about. That's what the site looked like from above back then. There was a lot of extra equipment for Skylab, but for Apollo, it was pretty simple. 85-foot antenna, the main operations building, and the power building, with fuel tanks for the cars, which used to park up here. And we had a guy who worked in the powerhouse who was the world's fastest backer. He could take 6 shift cars and refuel them all in less than 15 minutes. So, of course, nobody needs to get in his way. This was a floor plan of the main building, and actually the main operations all took place within this area here. The rest was company officers, departmental people, and logistics, plus toilets and gosh knows what else. Downstairs, because it was on a slope, we had things like the cafeteria down here is called crew room. We had the best cooks out of the 3 stations. People used to come around to our place from Aurora and Tipperville to sample the meals. Another thing that we had here was a couple of bedrooms, which I remember with great affection. You couldn't sleep a wink in there. It was so much noise going on from the cafeteria that the bedrooms you couldn't. But I did try to sleep there quite a few times. This was all the main equipment. And this is where I worked, the operations console area. Now, the ops console was used because you needed to centralize things. If Houston called or Goddard called, it was important to be answered, but you couldn't let everybody else answer. They would have had long conversations. So we did control that a little bit. So we had the computers next door to the operations console, telemetry equipment to pull out. Excuse me. Telemetry equipment to pull out all the parameters like astronaut health and things. And the main part, which was the unified S-band equipment, which was what we used to call the front end equipment, the antenna, the receivers, the transmitters, and the ranging equipment and all that sort of thing. We had about 20 people on a shift most of the time, and it was certainly a team effort. The people who were on the shift for operations also maintained the equipment, and it was marvelous. It not like it became later on with the Deep Space Network. Most of the equipment was not run remotely. It was run by people sitting in front of the equipment. It's all analog stuff, great. See what was happening. So anyhow, that was the main operations area. And that down below was the cafeteria, most important. This was the antenna on opening day in 1967. And guess who came to open the site? Can anybody remember who the Prime Minister was in 1967? Harold Holt.
Harold Holt.
Yes.
Soon to disappear.
I had a lovely time with Harold when he came around the station. I was standing in front of the operations console going to demonstrate the NASA communications network to him. It was quite fun, really, because if you have 200 or 300 people on the network, the voice network, which we had on the main one, you had to have a press to talk switch so that all the external noise didn't go into the one network. And Harold Holt didn't know how to do that. And he had very slick back, glossy hair, so we had to hold his headset on top of his headset while pushing the button for him. Anyhow, I was going to demonstrate this, and he didn't want to know about it. It was amazing to be able to talk to Alaska and all these other places in those days. But he didn't want to know. He said, I want to speak to my old mate Hubert Humphrey, the Vice President of the United States. So I said, well, I'll try. And I called up Goddard Space Flight Center in Washington. And they were the center of the voice communications. And I said, I've got the Prime Minister of Australia here. He would like to speak to the Vice President Hubert Humphreys. And within a millisecond, there was White House here. So, righto. And when the White House came on the line, I said, I got the Prime Minister of Australia who'd really like to speak to the Vice President. Oh, I don't know about that. He's out in his car. And, there was no such thing as car phones in those days. I said, we'll see what we can do. And we'll see what we can do. And fairly quickly, they got the Vice President from his car. And so that's when they're holding the headset on the head and they pressing the button. Had to go. It's quite good. It's a good day altogether. So I'm going to show these really fast. I'm not going to explain everything that's on here. It's a pain to do it, but basically this was the equivalent, what they called USB on the front end equipment, the microwave, the low noise amplifiers, 4 receivers, 2 transmitters, and some carrier oscillators, frequency stands, that was all the front end equipment. And we had data demodulators coming from the receivers, but also from Tip and Biller via the microwave link, and Parks when they were supporting. Data went from there to voice equipment, telemetry equipment, television equipment, high-speed data, tracking data going out, and timing codes and generation started there. Atomic frequency standards. We had, I think, three or four atomic frequency standards. And later on, I worked at Tip and Biller, and one day we lost the time standards. And that was absolute chaos because nobody had ever tried to work without time going into their systems, and nobody knew how to fix it because there was triple time standards and majority voting and all sorts of things. Anyhow, that was basically the front end. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but if anybody wants to ask questions after we've finished here, I'm hoping to keep 10 minutes for questions. So you better keep me abreast of how much time we've got. This was Tip and Biller's block diagram because they built a new, where are we? There's a building right on the side of the main building at Tippinbilla, which was built specifically for Apollo. And they had basically the same equipment as we had. And then they sent their data from their 4 receivers via the microwave link to us, Honeysuckle. And they were basically run from the operations console at Honeysuckle. I should point out that this was the only lunar distance tracking station in the Southern Hemisphere. So it was particularly important. If we had been offline, they wouldn't have launched. It's that simple. And I put that on because I didn't want people to think that Parkes had a lot of equipment after watching certain movies and things. They didn't. They had a low noise amplifier, a couple of receivers, and data demodulators so they could send us telemetry and voice and TV to Sydney, not to us. I should say one thing about the TV. It was never intended to have TV on the first lunar landing. The astronauts absolutely hated the idea. And so did Houston flight controllers. But eventually Chris Kraft, who was in charge of spaceflight operations at Houston, said the American taxpayer is paying for this. They need to see the television. So television was added. This is to show the extra equipment that we had at Honeysuckle. There's the front end equipment here that we just looked at. And then we had command, telemetry, computers, special equipment for biomedical, because that was very important. Backpack information. I put this up just so you can have a laugh. The main computers were 2 UNIVAC 642Bs, one for command, one for telemetry. I'm trying not to read this. You could see the specifications there in the second bullet. And mostly they were handling lots of I/O, not so much computing, not serious computing, mostly input-output. They later added 64K of shared memory. I'll show you on the photograph computers. And we also had 2 smaller UNIVAC systems. We had the guy in the computer picture that I'm going to show you soon develop simulation software for these smaller computers. And when the Goddard used to send network training super constellation aircraft out with all the spacecraft equipment in there. And they got the shock of their lives when we started sending commands to their cameras and things. No other side had ever done that. Yeah. This M&M command module and the lunar module spacecraft had 36.864 16-bit words. I don't know if you've ever seen any movies of this, but they used to actually weave the program into this rote memory. So it was ultra reliable, but very expensive. And the computers in the spacecraft weighed nearly 30 kilograms. I'm going through a whole lot of pictures now. How much time have I got?
Well, it's 12:20.
So you got 40 minutes. We've got about 30 minutes left for your questions.
Oh, okay. All the rest of this is going to be pictures mostly. This is the guy who used to drive the antenna, one of them, on one of the ships. And he's got this little ball there, which was not a full-size bowling ball. It was actually an American duck pin bowling ball. And he only really used it to move the antenna from Stowe down to Point. And then after that, we could automatically track the source. And we did that by having we had 4 feed horns in the antenna. And once it was pointing roughly at the spacecraft, the antenna would be moved to equalize the signal in all 4 downlinks. And once it was locked up, which was a job done between this fellow and the receiver guys, once it was locked up, he would automatically follow the spacecraft. Auto track. Of course, we always had to have backup people, and that was the backup operator, who's now can't remember what age he is now, but
52.
52?
Yeah.
Something like that. Yes.
Yeah, my little brother.
This was the 4 receivers at Honeysuckle, had an identical setup at Tip and Billa from this part of things. And most of the time we were only tracking one spacecraft with all 4 receivers. And we could look at the differences, of course, in the various receivers and pick the best ones, etc. This was arranging equipment. Interesting equipment. Used to send what they called a pseudo-random code up to the spacecraft. Pseudo-random code was actually random numbers, but it repeated after a certain length. So that's why they call it pseudo-random. To send it up to the spacecraft just turn it around and send it back down to Earth. And it can measure lunar distances to within them. 2 or 3 meters, as far as I know. It's pretty accurate. But this was the only guy who really understood it. It was a very difficult system to maintain and run. I'm sorry about the quality of this picture. I haven't got a better one. This was 2 of the decommutators, or part of 2 of the decommutators. They were pretty unreliable, I have to say. All these cards were stuck against a backplane, and they put, in the end, because it was so unreliable, they put cables across the back and tightened them all up, and everything was a bit more reliable after that. The thing about it is, now here's the computers, here's the guy who wrote the simulation codes. This is only half of them. Over here we've got one of the main computers. This could be either command or telemetry. In this case, it's got a CP, so it's command computer on that day. Paper tape input to import programs and this sort of thing. And some people might be interested in the clock up on the wall here. Zulu, of course, is another abbreviation for GMT. And then we had GET, which was time from launch. Just about everything after launch was related to GET. Then we had another clock under here, which was time to horizon, which had to be worked out in relation to the, worked out manually, I might say, in relation to the, what can I say? We had quite high hills around Canberra. The original idea was we were going to get hit by interference from cars and things. It didn't actually worry much, but it did mean that we had quite a high horizon in some places. And so, unfortunately, Houston didn't take that into account most of the time. Anyhow, we had two smaller UNIVAC computers, a lot of tape handlers for recording what went on and reloading and various other things. And see, he's got a thing to wind up paper tape there. So I used to drive those clocks from my console. And here was Mike Din, who was the first online here today. And myself, what a handsome bloke smoking a fag. When we went to Skylab, I knew we'd have to give up smoking. It's really bad. I was smoking 2 packs a day before we finished on Apollo. But when Skylab came along, we knew they were going to stop smoking inside. There'd never be any time to get out, because in between passes on Skylab, you had numerous playbacks of voice telemetry and everything else. So, Mike, I hope you like your picture there. This was actually used. This picture was used by the Australian Mint to make a couple of coins, a $1 and $2 coin, which they were selling there for quite a while. They might still be selling them. They probably make them out again when we have the 60th anniversary. So Mike had a very simple plus or minus countdown clock, so he could do that. This is me, the handsome bloke, and over there I had a couple of controls to set up the horizon and the GET clocks. Most of the meters and things we stole from one of the sites which was shutting down before Apollo. One of the ships, actually. And this console looked like no other console in the whole of the manned spaceflight network. Mostly due to Mike. He just said, what are we going to do? One of the things that he did, and Mike will remember this, is simplify the voice loop and all the rest of it. When the simulation people used to come around with the aircraft, they couldn't understand what we were talking about, because instead of saying M&O, that's this man, from A&O, assistant M&O, on the M&O loop, which is ridiculous. He changed all the loop names, and so it became Ops 1, Ops 2 on Alpha. Much easier, but nobody outside the station knew what was going on. And one of the other things we did, we had these days it sounds ridiculous, but we did have some magnetic bits and pieces designating equipments to be used, some elastic, which went to various other bits of equipment. And then we had a TV camera over here. We used to look at that and put it around the site, all analog. So that's where we worked. And next door to us was a communications room. We had a lot of teletype operators. This was the main communications backwards and forwards. You couldn't send a message out by high-speed lines or anything. I think there was two modems, two 7.2 kilobit modems were there, I think, which was all the lines, the voice lines could take. Spent a lot of time sorting all that lot out. It was $15,000 an hour in those days to enter a line, so that when you did tests on the lines, it was expensive. Anyhow, there was a hatch from there through to the operations room, and they could tear off a message from these machines and pass it through in double quick time. Yes, we had an old road originally, which was very treacherous dirt. And then they built this new road, which, as you can see, has got Armco and still there. You can use it if you get a honeysuckle. I hope you will, some people. But we did have the occasional rockfall on the road. And this was the best one, where we had a large portion of the road which had been undermined by water coming down the hill. And there was about a, I don't know, 100-meter drop down here. And it just all fell down the hill. And the staff had to bring buses up and things for the staff. There was cars everywhere, either side of the bridge in the road. So that was an interesting episode. I was there for 3 or 4 days on overtime after the first 8 hours, which shouldn't brag about that, should I? I used to drink a lot of coffee. Now, this is where I hope it's going to work. Colin McKellar is our Honeysuckle Creek website master, and he's absolutely brilliant. If it hadn't been for him, we would have departed from this world a lot earlier. So do take a look at that site if you get a chance, because it's a huge website, I might add. It's expanded from Honeysuckle to all the Australian sites, and then into all the ships and all the sites around the world. Is just huge. If you're interested in Apollo, that is the place to go. honeysucklecreek.net. Now, I'm just going to explain that this is going to be a little short video of when Armstrong first stepped onto the moon. And the left audio channel, which hopefully is going down that side of the room, is the astronauts talking to Houston. And the right channel is the right audio channel is Houston, and the tracking stations called Net 2. Net 1 was the astronauts, Net 2 was Houston, Net 3 was Goddard. Houston and the tracking stations and also the main operations loop of Honeysuckle mixed together. So it's going to seem a little confusing, but we'll have a go if it works. The reason that there's a time on there is that for our anniversaries, we generally play a bit of this and we synchronize it to real time. We have the anniversaries on the day or close to it. So Let's see if it works. Yes, there was a bit going on when Armstrong was coming down the ladder. There was some concern about the biomedical information from the backpacks and the lunar module and so on. Got quite complicated. Whoops, come back. Now, I'm going back here because I believe we should be able to show this.
That's all right. Stop pressing.
I'll do it for you. So,
Baseline biomedical TV. I'm just going to hold that there for a minute. This guy is Ed von Renoir, who came first from the Antarctic station to us and became the video operator. And he really knew what he was doing. I'll tell you why in a minute, but that was some of his equipment that he used to record TV and send it on down to Sydney Video, which was placing the Paddington Telephone Exchange, which looked at the TV from both ourselves and from Parks and decided which was the best. But Ed was very good. He was ex-ABC as well, and he certainly knew his stuff when it came to tweaking a little bit. And I'll tell you why it helped in a minute. So that was his equipment, or some of it. Now I have to explain one thing about the TV. When they deployed the camera with a lanyard from the top of the ladder, it came up with some pictures of the ladder and the ground around and so on. And we had had a million simulations and many, many hours of lining up the video on the low quality lines back to Houston. And nobody had ever simulated what it was going to look like. Never been there before. They had no idea what it was going to look like themselves, let alone us. So this is from Goldstone site. It's upside down, and they were a bit scared to do very much about it. So I'm going to continue this one. Whoops, go back again. Can you carry that on for me? One of the things you can see is that the ladder looks almost vertical. It wasn't. If you look at the horizon, it's tilted and it makes it look much worse than it really was. But the bottom step of the ladder was quite high off the pad of the lunar module. Let's go again. Back up. Oh, that's like, you're still hanging on. We didn't get.
Finish the thing. Oh, for you, sorry.
Yes, I should explain that the original flight plan, or the flight plan we had, showed them taking a couple of hours rest or something before they got out of the spacecraft onto the lunar surface. Now, you know, if you finally got there and you managed to land the thing, why wouldn't you go out? So anyhow, they decided they would go out early, a couple of hours early actually. And that caused a few things around the network to happen. First thing was that Goldstone had trained one shift to be the, quotes, best shift we're going to be on when Armstrong came down the ladder. Of course, they weren't. They had their backup shift. I mean, operationally, that was terrible. You couldn't have some people trained up one way and other people trained up another. Anyhow, that's what they did. And so they had a problem with the shift that was on, and they were very reluctant to change anything, and then they changed the wrong things. As I say, nobody'd ever seen what was going to be, the TV picture was going to look like. It wasn't until Apollo 15 we got to decent color TV with a different camera. As for Parkes, they were due to be up by the time that Armstrong got up, but they could see Armstrong coming down the ladder using what they call the offset feed at Parkes. So it was a bit of a performance to change from the offset feed to the main feed, and Houston weren't having any of it until they got to the main feed. They didn't want interruptions in it. So because Parkes had a 30-degree elevation limit, they didn't have the signal in the main beam when Armstrong first stepped onto the moon. And in an unrelated, sort of unrelated, a couple of days before that, they'd had a fire in the transmitter equipment up in the antenna at Tippinbilla. And normally Tippinbilla would be tracking the lunar module because they had, being a deep space station, they had maser amplifiers. And they were more sensitive and had a lower noise than the normal amplifiers. And because they had a fire in there 2 days before, I think it was, and they spent all night and all day, and people crawling into very dangerous spaces, and they fixed it. But Houston weren't going to use them for that. So they changed. So having honeysuckle tracking the lunar module and Tippinbilla tracking the command module. That was, we had, there's a certain film called The Dish, and amongst other things, it had the Prime Minister, a Prime Minister visiting Parkes and their antenna. So we felt we had to say something about a real Prime Minister visiting a real tracking station. Here he is there, John Gordon, who was an ex-Spitfire pilot, I might add, for quite an achievement for a Prime Minister. And he was very interested, but, you know, it's being swamped with all the equipment and things. And everybody in that lot, except for that fellow, was smoking. We were smoking in a very small space, probably no more than this wide, and not a great deal longer than this. Anyhow, it's quite funny. This fellow is a good friend of mine who was a deputy station director. Whoops. This fellow was named Ian Grant. He was on for the early part before Mike Dim and Tom Reed joined us, who were the station director and deputy station directors. This is another deputy station director. And it's a lovely fellow, but he came from Scotland and he was so broad, they couldn't understand a word he said. They all thought he was Australian with a very bad accent, but another Scotsman. We used to call about the Scottish mafia. There was quite a lot of Scots in the station staff. Anyhow, Prime Minister came around and Tony Eggleton, some people might remember, standing there, and a whole lot of people outside there. This is my log on the day, part of it. You can see I did a few calculations about GT when ground elapsed time when Armstrong was going to come out and all that sort of stuff. They told us all these times and they didn't abide by them anyhow, so we were lucky we were failing with it. But we were also tracking the lunar module with Collins, astronaut in there, and that was actually keeping us busy as well as the lunar module. And this is where I noticed that the CDR was on the moon. I should have written CDR, which was the commander of the spacecraft on the lunar surface, would have looked better. But anyhow, and that was a note to say that they were switching between honeysuckle and goldstone. But we were not, believe it or not, we were not required to keep a log. But we did anyhow, and I got London. We did because it was really useful. And you notice why. I didn't like the politicians getting involved. But here I wrote Nixon uplinking. This is when President Nixon talked to the astronauts. And it was very complicated because we had to do relays between the orbiting CSM and the lunar module, the outside world and everything else. So having Nixon uplink was not appreciated, not by me anyhow. This was just to illustrate that we had the original downlink, and that wasn't too bad for the size of antenna we had. It was a better picture than Parkes were getting, actually. This was EKGs. This was quite interesting that when Neil stepped off the ladder onto the lunar surface, he was doing 112 beats per minute. And that was quite something because when they took off in the Saturn V, the biggest rocket ever made, doing 84 beats a minute. So there's quite a difference.
So John,
See the GMT time tags up the top there.
John, if you want to leave some time for questions, probably should wind up now.
Sorry,
If you want to leave some time for questions, we should probably wind up now.
right, okay. Well, all the rest of this is just pictures anyhow, so I'll flash through a few pictures. I thought anybody who's in the communications world would be happy with this song that was written, Principle of Communications, I'm All Right at the Test Jack. As we cluster around the console, there's a gleam in every eye. For today we prove the circuit, or at least today we try. We're going to check the line up all the way from end to end. It's a network competition. You win anytime you send. The sending end is always perfect, and we are the sending site. So rest assured the signal will be leaving you all right. 3 pages of this. And this is graffiti I'm just covering here briefly. But the simulations we ran some pretty nasty ones where we used to have fires and people carried off in stretchers and all sorts of things we produced, as well as pulling modules out of equipment. And people had to get it fixed in amongst all this. We had one guy in the telemetry department who was collapsed on the ground with a heart failure, and they had to cart him off on a stretcher. And of course he was fine, but one guy was so impressed by this he went outside and was sick. So anyhow, bit of graffiti there. Michael Din, Master of Ceremonies, John Saxon Productions. Michael Din was the first one to log in online this morning. Buzz Aldrin sent us a picture to my friends from Honeysuckle Creek. Many thanks and best wishes. Magnificent desolation. That's one of the few pictures of Neil Armstrong. Buzz Aldrin didn't take any pictures. He left Neil Armstrong to take all the pictures. Here's Buzz coming down the ladder. These are now taken from the actual cameras that the astronauts had after it was developed after the flight. That's Buzz coming down the ladder. You can see the horizons are various angles, which is interesting. He was standing around, not sure what he was doing there. He was getting equipment to leave on the lunar surface there. Later on, missions were very complicated setups. So it was a fairly standardized one, fairly basic one for Apollo 11. And here he's getting the gear out of the bottom of the lunar module. And can't see the ladder. Must be over the other side. Anyhow, that's setting up the solar wind experiment where they're looking for particles. And there's the 2 arc lights up on the side there. All the hoax people are convinced that there were arc lights in the TV studio that all this was done in, but actually it's reflections inside the lens. It's getting a bit too close to the sun there. Was it all a hoax? I can't resist sometimes. 400 plus workers kept the secret for 50 plus years. If we were not told, and we weren't, then we were fooled. So how is it fake for us at the ground stations? Well, as I say, it would have been easier just to do the mission as an advertisement to try and think it. There's nothing secret on site. You have been aware of data feeds for every increasing spacecraft range, very accurate Doppler signatures, and TV signals not coming via the antenna for stars. So that's the important one. The Russians were very interested in what was going on, monitoring the whole mission. And if you'd managed to fool them one time, why do it 6 more times? That's my main point. So there you go. Open to questions if anybody has any.
So can I suggest that if there are any questions in the room, we take those first, If anybody online has any questions, if you can raise your hand, then we'll come to you and in turn. So any questions in the room?
So what was your background before entering the space
What's
program?
my background? Oh, well, I was lucky, very lucky, as you can imagine. I came down to Australia a couple of times on a totally different project, dropping nasty things over the Woomera Range. No atomic. Somebody said atomic weapons were dropped at Woomera, they never were. So I was flying, came down a couple of times, couldn't wait to get back, especially after I married my Australian girlfriend in England. Who was born into a woman and came out as a 10-pound pom, because she was my dependent by then. So, I don't know if we got any more questions.
He was an electrical engineer.
Sure, another hand up.
Why was log keeping not required? Because it seemed such a fundamental practice that was well established at that time.
You would think so, that it would be fundamental, and we regarded it as such, although we were pretty damn busy pressing buttons and twiddling knobs and things to be able to put too much down. I might say there's 21 pages in the Apollo 11 log. By the time we got to Apollo 15, I kept that log as well. It was up to 112 pages or something for Apollo 15. But it didn't have to be written down really, because it was all in the data one way or another. So they could resurrect our data later and look at it, but it was good to have those handwritten logs because you could come back with a quick answer immediately. There you go, that's the end of that.
So,
Any more questions?
yeah, I don't see any questions. I don't see any hands raised online. If you do have a question online, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you. I don't see any at the moment. And we are actually just 3 minutes over 1 o'clock. So unless there are any final questions in the room.
So at the beginning, why did
I fully expected my ex-boss to come in with a question he was first of all.
answer the questions? Why they didn't choose parks directly?
Sorry,
They choose. Why didn't choose parks?
why not just choose Parks?
Yes, parks is already
Well,
established.
Parks was a radio science station. It was almost impossible to modify to add transmitters and other equipment that they would need. And so they were just another extra source as far as we were concerned of data coming in. And we were happy that they had good quality TV. Did I mention that TV was never agreed originally?
Yeah.
We got one hand.
We-
Actually got a question.
So you've got another question?
No, so I'm,
No, of course he does.
Mike has a question online.
yeah, Mike,
We'll call on.
Mike, can you go ahead? Open up your mic and just ask a question.
Don't hear him.
He's still on mute.
You should see Mike set up at home. Should be able to do this in his sleep.
Can you unmute him, Lily?
No,
No?
I cannot unmute him.
Maybe you can text it.
Mike, we cannot hear you.
Oh, here we go. Oh, it's online.
Yes.
It's not.
It's live.
We can't unmute him, so.
So, Mike, we can't hear you. You have to unmute somehow.
Mike was director of TDB Lab during Apollo and worked closely with John. So was the see those other pictures. And that time company is 30 kilograms.
It's got a question.
By the way, where were you born?
Those three.
Okay, so since we don't seem to be able to get Mike, Ed, can you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks very much for that great presentation, John. There's so much wonderful detail in that you only get when you're there and you can see it all. But I'm going to ask a maybe slightly interesting question. Tidbinbilla and Parkes we're sister stations in many ways, and we always had this rivalry. Did you get that sense back in those days as well when you're doing Apollo?
No, not at all. Although I must admit, for Apollo 8, which was the first time they went to the moon and went around the moon 10 times, we had the lion's share of that mission due to celestial mechanics and other reasons. And it was a big thrill for us because it was the first time we'd been used for our real purpose, which was lunar distance tracking and communications. I've got a good picture of you, Ed.
Oh, good. Second question for you, while Mike's trying to unmute. What did you say to the Prime Minister?
What did I say to the Prime Minister? Nothing. Nothing. It's an interesting story about Gordon, though. He not only came around on the day, much to my annoyance, but he came around at the weekend, driven by his social secretary, and asked if he could look around, and the guard wouldn't let him in. Wouldn't let him in. Had to talk to the shift supervisor, and the shift supervisor at the time said, "Yeah, we'll show him around." And so he had another tour on the weekend.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Thanks, Ed. So, Mike,
He's still moving.
you're still muted. So I think we might just have to move on. So I think it's been an excellent talk by John. Some great insights into the history that we have here in the Canberra region and about the Apollo program, and some of the insights, as Ed said, that you don't see until you hear someone like John talk about them. So and those really minutiae things, I was fascinated by the point that John made that at some point in the program, we weren't allowed to smoke anymore in the rooms, and that would have been a big thing for people at the time. And so
It was 2 packs a day at the end of Apollo.
Yeah.
And I knew that for Skylab, we would have to go outside for a smoke, and there would never be a chance, because in between each pass in Skylab, there was a million things we had to do, mostly playbacks of voice or telemetry or something like that.
So you learned to give up very quickly.
I did. You know, I did it. I went to classes where they hypnotized you and told you how to stop smoking and how to reinforce that message every day. And I stopped smoking overnight.
Okay,
2 packs a day to nothing.
that's good. Okay, all right, I think we might close it there. So thank you everybody for your attendance. Please join me in thanking John.
He said when I was recording, we'll provide you the link of the recording link. Thank you very much.
Colin, he's there. This man, Colin McKellar, knows more about Apollo and everything else than the rest of us put together. He's done the big website,
Right.
and he knows all the astronauts and everybody else. Fantastic.
We'd like to hear more about this story.